In this video, I'm going to go over the entire reason why we went with an Escalade, why the frame is so beneficial to the C10, and what lines up, what doesn't line up, and how you guys can do this very cheaply and easily onto a C10 project that you guys are working on. What's going on, guys? Welcome back to another episode of Rustomod Garage. If you missed last week's episode, we were building a 1968 Chevrolet C10 short bed, and we're actually putting the whole body of the C10 onto a Cadillac Escalade frame. And then we ended up turboing this C10, putting an LS3 in it, and making a 700 horsepower all-wheel drive Chevrolet C10 to go drag racing with. We want to do drag and drive events like Hot Rod Power Tour, Rocky Mountain Race Week, and a bunch of other cool drag and drive events with this truck. So I'm going to show you guys how we built the whole thing, and so maybe if you guys are building an all-wheel drive C10, you can see how we did it and see some things that maybe you want to do differently, or some things that you could get some advice from seeing our build on the C10. So in the last video, I kind of briefly explained why I went with the Cadillac Escalade. In this video, I'm going to go over the entire reason why we went with an Escalade, why the frame is so beneficial to the C10, and what lines up, what doesn't line up, and how you guys can do this very cheaply and easily onto a C10 project that you guys are working on. The reason the Escalade is so nice to put under a C10 is because it's all-wheel drive from the factory. And it also has an aluminum block LS3 style V8 instead of some of the Tahoe and Suburban style where it has a cast iron 5.3, or you could get some 6.0s. Now that's just what I went with. If you guys prefer to get a cheaper, less expensive model, you can go with the 07 to 14 Tahoe or Yukon, and it's pretty much the exact same frame. It has a different transfer case, and it has a cast iron engine. So to start, the Tahoe style frames used in the Yukon, Escalade, and Denali's are 116 inches, and they also come in longer wheelbases. But for the short bed C10, we're going to use a 116 inch Cadillac Escalade frame, also found on the Yukon Denali and the Chevrolet Tahoe. Now the 116 inch wheelbase is key because the factory short bed C10 wheelbase is 115 inches, so it's only 1 inch longer than the C10 wheelbase it was originally. The width also comes into factor, where the width of the Cadillac Escalade is much wider than the stock Chevrolet C10. And I'll show you some things we did to accommodate that. But main factor would be the wheelbase and how it's very close to the original wheelbase that the C10 was. So now I'm going to lift the C10 up and give you guys a closer look onto what we changed on the frame, and so you guys can probably make some changes of your own to your C10 project. So now they got the C10 up in the air, I'll give you guys a walk around of how the truck looks underneath and seeing what differences there is in the frame versus the standard C10 to the Escalade frame swap. And I'll start from the front and then work my way back. Alright, so starting with the front, as you can see on the front of the frame where the bumper and the whole entire front cab mount, we ended up notching the Escalade frame down, and we tried to utilize as many factory C10 mounts as there were as possible. We didn't want to make things that we didn't have to. We wanted to make it as easy as possible, so we tried to utilize as many factory mounts as we could. So on the factory core support, there's a mount right here, and the Escalade frame is quite a bit wider than the factory C10 frame. Factory C10 frame sits inside of these mounts, as you can see up here, while the Escalade frame runs right directly on top of those mounts, which we were thinking would be a problem, but ended up actually working out in our favor. So instead of making new mounts, we ended up just putting a rubber isolator right in between those, and then we ended up just drilling straight through the frame, mounting the front clip that way, and we did similar things with the cab. I had to make some custom bumper brackets and then had to notch the front of this frame in order to fit our front clip. So as you can see on this section is how thick this frame normally is, and the difference is between where the front clip has to sit. It sits quite a bit lower than it does on the rest of the cab. And then moving around, we are running coilovers on this setup, and there's not that many companies that make coilovers. We just have some Max Peating Rods coilovers on it for now, and looking to get dual adjustable coilovers made for this probably. A lot of this suspension shares the same geometry as the Silverados and the Sierras. They make a bit more suspension products for those, but we wanted to make the truck as low as possible, so we wanted to put it on coilovers, set the ride height that we want, dial the look in of the body from there. As you can see from underneath, it looks pretty much like a factory Escalade does. The motor is the same motor that came in the Escalade, but the drive shaft and the transmission are different. On our setup, we wanted to go with a 4L80E transmission out of a 2500 truck. So in order to do that, the transmission crossmember had to be moved back. As you can see here, the original crossmember was probably 4 inches closer than it is now. We ended up slicing the crossmember and then pushing it back in order to fit our 4L80E transmission. This also required us to change the front and rear drive shafts to different lengths, and that is also because we wanted to run an NV241C transfer case. So this is out of a 2500 truck. It's a little bit better for as much power as we're running through this. This stock Escalade transfer case uses a viscous coupling. It just wouldn't work as well with the all-wheel drive setup than if we could just leave this transfer case in four-wheel drive. So we ended up getting the rear drive shaft shortened and going with the 4L80E, and then moving the transmission crossmember back. Now for the cab mounts, we ended up going straight through the frame like we did on the front cab mounts. As you can see here, we put a rubber isolator under the cab mount and then drilled straight through. We did the same thing on the other side. It was the easiest way that we could do this, and without having to make stuff that we didn't need to recreate. It ended up working really well. The C10 sits perfectly right on top of the Escalade frame where the cab originally mounts to. It wasn't so easy in the rear. We ended up cutting all of the mounts off of the Escalade on the outside. As you can see, there was an existing mount here that we ended up slicing off and moving it to the inside of the cab, because the inner cab mounts on the rear of the C10 are a little bit narrower than they are on the front. The other modification that you have to do, it might be a little bit harder to see, but we had to notch this body here in order to fit the width of the C10. The rear of the cab has to be notched to fit over top of the frame. We were gonna go with the stock gas tank that the Escalade had originally, and that's kind of why we have this style cab mount on this side and it's different from the other one. This is actually the original gas tank mount, but we ended up just bolting it through for the rear cab mount because we wanted to try to run the factory style Escalade tank. But we ended up going with the E85 setup, and you can still do that on a factory Escalade tank, but it just made it a whole lot easier to use 2 fuel pumps instead of the single fuel pump that was in the Escalade originally for the amount of boost that we wanted to run. So we ended up going with a fuel cell. But if you do want to do this swap and you want to utilize everything factory, you could do the factory fuel tank right here and just do the cab mount very similar to this, where we just put a plate on top and then box this in, and it actually worked really well. For the bed mounts, I ended up just welding some posts up from the bed, and then I will get farther into the body, how it's mounted in the bed in a different video where I show you what we had to modify to the C10 truck to adapt the body to the frame. I did end up making some mounts on the bed and they turned out pretty slick. So I'll show you guys that in the next video. To accommodate that 1-inch wheelbase, this company Spawn Performance makes rear trailing arms that are adjustable. So we ended up setting the cab and the bed right where they were supposed to be on the stock wheelbase, and then moving the rear axle forward an inch to accommodate the wheel well. And the wheel isn't perfectly aligned originally in the truck, so we wanted to align it correctly whenever we did this. So it's a little bit different of a wheelbase, but we ended up putting the wheel center in the wheel well, and it looks pretty factory from the ground. You wouldn't know that it's frame swapped. So we ended up using these two trailing arms in the rear to move the front axle forward, and then that allowed us to be able to accommodate the wheelbase of the original truck. For our fuel cell, we ended up using this stock spare tire mount to mount our fuel cell. We made some brackets to be able to fit on the bottom. I wanted to run E85 and I wanted dual pumps on this setup. I ended up getting a Rhodes Racing fuel cell and then making that fit in the spare tire. And you can see that where it's mounted currently. This ended up working really well, and I think it's one of my favorite aspects of the build is how clean this looks. Just utilizing the factory frame to be able to mount this in a factory piece, ended up relocating the fuel cell in a really clean way. And you can see our rear coilovers are on there as well. And we ended up going with the rear traction bar to center the rear axle with how low the C10 is now on the Escalade frame. Alright, so now I have the C10 back on the ground to get a better look at some things. So here's our fuel cell mount, how you can see it in the back. The spare tire location was right here in the back, so we ended up cutting that out, and like I said, we made some brackets to fit that fuel cell. Another thing that we did was when we mounted the bed, we ended up utilizing some existing body mounts that were on there to mount the bed, so that way it would bolt right on like the factory body would onto the Escalade or Tahoe. Tried to make it as sleek as possible without too many bolts poking up, because I do want to do a wood style bed in this eventually. Right now we're just finishing some stuff up, so we don't want to put a bed on it right now, but eventually that will happen, and I'll show you guys how we're going to do a full wood bed in this thing. I have some pretty cool ideas. Also, I want to show you guys how we mounted the rear of the roll cage so that it looks pretty factory and looks like it was intention, but it really wasn't. Since we did the coilovers in this, we actually have these coil spring perches in the back. And so we ended up wanting to run the roll cage down in the back, and saw these spring perches there that we weren't going to use anyway. I was initially going to cut them out, and we ended up just bolting the roll cage right to there. So it looks like we intended that to happen, but just working out perfectly like that. So our roll cage bolts right to our frame like it should, and it has factory locations for it, which is pretty neat. Now the other modification that you guys are going to have to do if you're going to do this kind of swap, the wheelbase is pretty good and you can probably get that figured out pretty easily. The issue with the Escalade swap is how wide it is. So the Escalade is quite a bit wider than the factory C10, and I'll show you guys how we come over some of those obstacles and show you guys how we ended up widening the truck, and maybe you guys could do something similar on your build. So if you can see down here, this is a step side bed obviously, and these fender flares unbolt from the side of the bed. Now the C10 is quite a bit narrower from the factory than the Escalade is, so the Escalade rear axle doesn't fit under the factory C10 bed. So what we had to do was water jet some spacers for this and bump the fender out about 1.5 inches to be able to clear the tire over the wheel well in the rear. If you guys have a regular fleet side bed, I'm not sure if you need to do this, but for whatever reason, the step side bed is too narrow, and it actually is inside of the width of the cab. If you can see now, the bed lines up perfectly with the width of the cab, but for some reason, on the factory C10, the step side is a much narrower. So now we're looking at the front of the truck. As you can see, when the truck is on the ground, there's quite a bit of camber when you lower one of these big SUVs, because it's made to sit a lot higher than what the truck is sitting at now. And that kind of helps us in a way, because the top of the tire tucks in under the fender quite a bit, enough to be able to turn and everything. But if you guys want to run a low suspension setup like this, the frame is quite a bit wider in the front. You're going to have to run quite a bit of camber. Now we're working on something to probably get a shorter, lower control arm, and that should bring the bottom of the wheel in some to be able to straighten the wheel up, and we'll have to see how that works, just to eliminate some of the tire wear issues that we're probably going to have once we put some miles on this thing. But there is severe amount of camber in the front, and that's just the nature of running a vehicle that is made to sit up a lot higher, running it as low as we are right now. But that is how we got through the width issue on the front of the C10, so we didn't have to widen anything like we did on the rear. As you can see, that rear of the fender on the back of the step side is perfectly flush with the cab, so that 1.5 inches is just the amount that it needs to fit. Perfect one with the looks wise of the truck and with how the Escalade frame is underneath of it. Now look under the hood here so you guys can see a little bit better of our frame. We don't have any fender liners in this truck right now. We probably will add some later, but honestly it helps a lot with cooling with how much exhaust we have wrapped around this LS3. And in future videos I'm going to get into the whole motor and what we've done to the motor and our full turbo kit and how we built the whole thing in a different video, but in this video I'm just going to talk about the frame setup. But you can see our front frame rail setup that we have is quite a bit wider than the original C10, and it fits perfectly right under the core support mounts. So we just drilled straight through those. So you can see down here where the frame is sitting right on this rib that goes for the cab mount on the original C10 cab. The same thing on this side. So that's pretty much all there is to it. The cab sits on the frame pretty well and lines up perfectly with a lot of the factory C10 mounts. So I just wanted to go over the entire frame setup that we have in the C10. Like I said, a Escalade, Yukon, and Tahoe would fit the same way from 07 to 14. You can see what we had to modify. Some things, if you want to run a 6-speed transmission that these come with originally, you don't have to modify the crossmember that we did for the transmission. It's just our setup that we have. Same with a bunch of other setups. If you don't mind your wheel being an inch off in the wheel well, you don't have to run those rear trailing arms. You could push your bed back an inch. There's a bunch of different ways to accommodate the wheelbase. And also, you don't have to be as low as we are. If you want it to sit more stock ride height, then you probably won't have an issue with the front having clearance issues. It's just how low we have the car sitting. We wanted to tuck the wheel in as much as we could. But that's gonna do it for this episode, guys. In the next episode, I'm gonna go over how we fit the cab to the frame and everything that we had to modify for the cab to be able to mount to the frame. And then we'll also go over the bed and how that's mounted and everything. And in future episodes, I'll go over the full turbo kit. I'll go over the whole engine build, and you guys will see this entire thing get built here on Rustomod. So make sure you guys like, comment, subscribe, and stay tuned for more content. And we're gonna have a bunch of different videos on this thing, racing on a bunch of different drag race, drag and drive event series. We have a bunch more builds coming up in the future, so you guys will definitely like those. So make sure you like, comment, subscribe, and we'll see you on the next one.